Chapter 12. The author's veracity. His design in publishing this work. His censure of those travelers who swerve from the truth. The author clears himself from any sinister ends in writing. An objection answered. The method of planting colonies. His native country commended. The right of the crown to those countries described by the author is justified. The difficulty of conquering them. The author takes his last leave of the reader, proposes his manner of living for the future, gives good advice, and concludes. Thus, gentle reader, I have given thee a faithful history of my travels for 16 years and above 7 months, wherein I have not been so studious of ornament as of truth, I could, perhaps, like others, have astonished thee with strange, improbable tales, but I rather chose to relate plain matter of fact, in the simplest manner and style, because my principal design was to inform, and not to amuse thee. It is easy for us who travel into remote countries, which are seldom visited by Englishmen or other Europeans, to form descriptions of wonderful animals both at sea and land, whereas a traveller's chief aim should be to make men wiser and better, and to improve their minds by the bad, as well as good, examples of what they deliver concerning foreign places. I could heartily wish a law was enacted that every traveller, before he was permitted to publish his voyages, should be obliged to make an oath before the Lord High Chancellor that all he intended to print was absolutely true to the best of his knowledge, for then the world would no longer be deceived, as it usually is, while some writers, to make their work pass the better upon the public, impose the grossest falsities on the unwary reader. I have perused several books of travels with great delight in my younger days, but having since gone over most parts of the globe, and being able to contradict many fabulous accounts from my own observations, it has given me a great disgust against this part of reading, and some indignation to see the credulity of mankind so impudently abused. Therefore, since my acquaintance were pleased to think my poor endeavours might not be unacceptable to my country, I imposed on myself, as a maxim never to be swerved from, that I would adhere strictly to the truth. Neither indeed can I be ever under the least temptation to vary from it, while I retain in my mind the lectures and examples of my noble master, and the other illustrious Wynnum, of whom I had so long the honour to be a humble hearer. Nec sic miseris fortuna fixit vanum etum Macedon improbit fingit. I know very well how little reputation is to be got by writings which require neither genius nor learning, nor indeed any other talent except a good memory or an exact journal. I know likewise that writers of travels, like dictionary makers, are sunk into oblivion by the weight and bulk of those who come last, and therefore lie uppermost. And it is highly probable that such travellers who shall hereafter visit the countries described in this work of mine may, by detecting my errors, if there be any, and adding many new discoveries of their own, justle me out of vogue, and stand in my place, making the world forget that ever I was an author. This indeed would be too great a mortification, if I wrote for fame, but as my sole intention was the public good, I cannot be altogether disappointed. For who can read of the virtues I have mentioned in the glorious Wynnums without being ashamed of his own vices when he considers himself as the reasoning governing animal of his country? I shall say nothing of those remote nations where Yahoos preside, among which the least corrupted are the Brobdingnagians, whose wide maxims in morality and government it would be our happiness to observe. But I forbear descanting further, and rather leave the judicious reader to his own remarks and application. I am not a little pleased that this work of mine can possibly meet with no censures. For what objections can be made against a writer who relates only plain fact that happened in such distant countries where we have not the least interest with respect either to travel or negotiations? I have carefully avoided every fault with which common writers of travels are too justly charged. Hush. Are Apologies for the Havanese. I have carefully avoided every fault with which common writers of travels are too too justly charged. Hush. We're almost done. I have carefully avoided every fault with which common writers of travels are often too justly charged. Besides, I meddle not the least with any party, but write without passion, prejudice, or ill will against any man or number of men. Whatsoever, I write for the noblest end, to inform and instruct mankind, over whom I may, without breach of modesty, pretend to some superiority from the advantage I receive by conversing, the little growler. I conceive, I may, I write for the noblest end, to inform and instruct mankind, over whom I may, without breach of modesty, pretend to some superiority from the advantages I received by conversing so long amongst the most accomplished Winhams. I write without any view to profit or praise. I never suffer a word to pass that may look like reflection, or possibly give the least offence, even to those who are ready to take it. So that I hope I may with justice pronounce myself an author perfectly blameless, against whom the tribes of answerers, considerers, observers, reflectors, detractors, remarkers will never be able to find matter for exercising their talents. I confess it was whispered to me that I was bound in duty, as a subject of England, to have given in a memorial to the Secretary of State at my first coming over, because whatever lands are discovered by subject belong to the Crown. But I doubt whether our conquests in the countries I treat of would be as easy as those of Fernando Cortez over the naked Americans. The Lilliputians, I think, are hardly worth the charge of a fleet and army to reduce them, and I question whether it might be prudent or safe to attempt the Brobdingnagians, or whether an English army would be as much at their ease with the flying island over their heads. The Winhams, indeed, appear not to be so well prepared for war, a science to which they are perfect strangers, and especially against massive weapons. However, supposing myself to be a minister of state, I could never give my advice for invading them. Their prudence, unanimity, unacquaintedness with fear, and their love of their country would amply supply all defects in the military art. Imagine 20,000 of them breaking into the midst of an European army, confounding the ranks, overturning the carriages, battering the warriors' faces into mummy by terrible yerks from their hinder hoofs. For they would well deserve the character given to Augustus, recultant undique tutus. But instead of proposals for conquering that magnanimous nation, I rather wish they were in a capacity or disposition to send a sufficient number of their inhabitants for civilizing Europe, by teaching us the first principles of honor, justice, truth, temperance, public spirit, fortitude, chastity, friendship, benevolence, and fidelity. The names of all which virtues are still retained among us in most languages, and are to be met in modern as well as ancient authors, which I am able to assert from my own small reading. But I had another reason, which made me less forward to enlarge his Majesty's dominions by my discoveries. To say the truth, I conceived a few scruples with relation to the distributive justice of princes upon those occasions. For instance, a crew of pirates are driven by a storm they know not whither. At length a boy discovers land from the topmast. They go on shore to rob and plunder. They see a harmless people, are entertained with kindness. They give the country a new name. They take formal possession of it for their king. They set up a rotten plank, or a stone for a memorial. They murder 2 or 3 dozen of the natives, bring away a couple more by force for a sample, return home, and get their pardon. Here commences a new dominion acquired with a title by divine right. Ships are sent with the first opportunity. The natives driven out or destroyed. Their princes tortured to discover their gold. A free license given to all acts of inhumanity and lust, the earth reeking with the blood of its inhabitants, and this execrable crew of butchers employed in so pious an expedition. is a modern colony, set to convert and civilize an idolatrous and barbarous people. But this description, I confess, does no mean affect by this description, I confess, does by no mean affect the British nation, who may be an example to the whole world for their wisdom, care, and justice in planting colonies, their liberal endowments for the advancement of religion and learning, their choice of devout and able pastors to propagate Christianity, their caution in stocking their provinces with people of sober lives and conversations from this their mother kingdom, their strict regard to the distribution of justice in supplying the civil administration through all their colonies with officers of greatest abilities, utter strangers to corruption, and to crown all by sending the most vigilant and virtuous governors, who have no other view than the happiness of the people over whom they preside, and the honor of the king their master. But as those countries which I have described do not appear to have any desire of being conquered and enslaved, murdered, or driven out by colonies, nor abound either in gold, silver, sugar, or tobacco, I did humbly conceive that they were by no means proper objects of our zeal, our valour, or our interest. However, if those whom it more concerns think it fit to be of another opinion, I am ready to suppose, when I shall be lawfully called, that no European did ever visit those countries before me. I mean, if the inhabitants ought to be believed, unless a dispute may arise concerning the two Yahoos, said to have been seen many years ago upon the mountain in Winnemland, from whence the opinion is that the race of those brutes hath descended, and these, for anything I know, may have been English, which, indeed, I was apt to suspect from the lineaments of their posterity's countenances, although very much defaced. But how far that will go to make out a title, I leave to the learned in colony law. But as to the formality of taking possession in my sovereign's name, it never came once into my thoughts, and if it had, yet, as my affairs then stood, I should perhaps, in point of prudence and self-preservation, have put it off to a better opportunity. Having thus answered the only objection that can ever be raised against me as a traveller, I here take a final leave of all my courteous readers, and return to enjoy my own speculations in my little garden at Redriff, to apply those excellent lessons of virtue which I learned among the Winhams, to instruct the Yahoos of my own family, as far as I shall find them docile animals, to behold my figure often in a glass, and thus, if possible, habituate myself by time to tolerate the sight of a human creature, to lament the brutality to Winhams in my own country, but always treat their persons with respect, for the sake of my noble master, his family, his friends, and the whole Winham race, whom these of ours have the honour to resemble in all their lineaments, however their intellectuals came to degenerate. I began last week to permit my wife to sit at dinner with me at the farthest end of a long table, and to answer, but with the utmost brevity, the few questions I asked her. Yet, the smell of a Yahoo continuing very offensive, I always keep my nose well stopped with rue, lavender, or tobacco leaves, and although it be hard for a man late in life to remove old habits, I am not altogether out of hopes in some time to suffer a neighbour Yahoo in my company, without the apprehensions I am yet under of his teeth or his claws. My reconcilement to the Yahoo kind, in general, might not be so difficult if they would be content with those vices and follies only which nature has entitled them to. I am not in the least provoked at the sight of a lawyer, a pickpocket, a colonel, a fool, a lord, a gamester, a politician, a whoremonger, a physician, an evidence, a suborner, an attorney, a traitor, or the like. This is all according to the due course of things. But when I behold a lump of deformity and disease, both in body and mind, smitten with pride, it immediately breaks all the measures of my patience. Neither shall I be able to comprehend how such an animal and such a vice could tally together. The wise and virtuous Winhams, whom abound in all excellences that can adorn a rational creature, have no name for this vice in their language, which has no terms to express anything that is evil, except those whereby they describe the detestable qualities of their Yahoos, among which they were not able to distinguish this of pride, for want of thorough understanding human nature, as it shows itself in other countries where that animal presides. But I, who had more experience, could plainly observe some rudiments of it among the wild yahoos. But the Winhams who live under the government of reason are no more proud of their good qualities they possess than I should be for not wanting a leg or an arm, which no man in his wit would boast of, although he might be miserable without them. I dwell the longer upon this subject from the desire I have to make the society of English Yahoo by any means not insupportable, and therefore I here entreat those who have any tincture of this absurd vice, that they will not presume it to come into my sight. And that is the end of Gulliver's Travels. More videos later.